This is the second panel of the day, and it's my first time doing actually moderating at Wilson Center, so I'm very excited. This is a topic, of course, very related to my work as well, so thank you for being here. This panel is titled as Changes in State Policy, How Has Multiculturalism Been Preserved or Defeated Through Law? Our presenters are, to my right, Harris Mylanas, and just to note, all the bios are available right outside, but I do want to highlight his most recent book, Politics of Nation Building, from Cambridge University Press. We have Terry, to my left, Terry Givens from the Woodrow Wilson Center, as well as Associate Professor of Government from University of Texas. And her latest book is titled Immigrant Politics in Western Europe from Lynn Rainier Press. And to my far left, Rachel Niles, from Senior Advisor from Open Society Justice Initiative. And we are very pleased to have all these very distinguished speakers. And why don't we follow the order and start with Harris.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nida, for organizing this and for having us here. So I'm going to give a brief overview that you have on your program already, what I'm going to talk about. But and I'm going to play two clips just to give a little bit of context for those of you who hear about all these things but haven't necessarily experienced them on your TV sets, because these things don't travel very much overseas. So what I'm going to argue in the end, and just to give you a preview, is that in order to understand and kind of address some of the questions that came up in the first panel that you probably, most of you were here, I think, for, I'm suggesting that a lot of what we're seeing or what we're experiencing as a decline of multiculturalism, which I'm going to define in a minute, or multicultural practices in Europe, are endogenous or the product of fluctuations basically in public perceptions about the security and economic consequences that migration has, or illegal migration in particular. And these are often triggered by global security and financial threats, not very surprisingly. But then those threats impact the salience of these issues in the domestic political agenda, which a lot of you in the United States also know of and have experienced. And then when that happens in a country, in a party system, very often the median voter, I'm going to show how that happens actually virtually, the median voter moves away from where it used to be on these issues more to the right, if you want. And that, I think, explains some of these actual decline of multicultural practices in some cases, but I will also highlight how this is this perception we have about the decline of multiculturalism at large is a product of what we call in political science selection bias, in the sense that we're only looking at the cases that make the news, and we forget that there are many more countries in the European Union and the Council of Europe at large that have not experienced this decline yet. But of course, if we keep on pushing in that direction in the discourse, or our perceptions can lead to a diffusion or demonstration effect. So that's a summary and outline of what you're going to hear. If you don't want to hear a more detailed version, you can go and continue the coffee break and and then come back for the next speaker. So, always have an executive summary, they say. So, What are some facts that I'm going to illustrate with some videos? What we're talking about, obviously, is different ways to manage diversity, right? We're talking about different ways to manage diversity and different ways to attain and achieve social order, right? So from a state perspective, at least, these are the big issues. And I just want to put this big frame into this. And we have two type of trends that we see, or those are the trends that at least Nida and I usually discuss when we have our coffee, we don't talk about anything else. It's basically first that we see the rise that we heard earlier by one of our speakers, the rise of nativist and right-wing parties in certain countries, again, not everywhere, but in certain countries, and that's a growing trend, and we should care about it, but again, it's not all over. And there are some outliers, as we heard, some cases where we would expect them to be more powerful, and they're not, and that has to be studied, and Terry will tell us why not. And those would be what I would call, they would be pushing for homogenizing tendencies, homogenizing policies. So these homogenizing policies are a specific sort of answer to these problems of attaining social order and managing diversity. How do you manage it when you're a right-wing nativist party? You want to make them the same with you, or you want to expel them if you think you cannot make them like you. So it's a very clear answer. So that's why it's a very good message, if you want, meaning in terms of quality of the message, how easy it travels to and it's conveyed. That doesn't mean any of us here condones it or not, but it's a very trendy, let's say, and easy to market from a media perspective point, right? The second trend we are experiencing is that even non-right-wing politicians, even social democrats, or even Christian democrats, even ruling parties, mainstream parties if you want, have kind of considered that multicultural practices or multiculturalism as a policy has failed. Most prominently, we have heard from Angela Merkel that multiculti is over, right? So multiculturalism now growingly is becoming, and we heard about that from Mary and the previous panel, it's growingly becoming substituted, if you want, or complemented for people like Kimilka by what we call civic integration policies, and I'll go into that in a minute. So some people see civic integration policies as the alternative to what used to be multiculturalism. Other people see it as complementary trends that don't have to be at odds with each other. And yet other people see those civic integration policies as really just a cover-up for the right-wing policies, meaning that basically they call civic integration what we used to call assimilation, okay? So those are the three interpretations of that move. Just to give you some meat, as we say, for what we're talking about, there are people like him.
Breivik, du ønsker ordet?
Mr. Breivik, you wanted to speak.
This is the first point.
I do not recognize the Norwegian Court. You've gotten your mandate from political parties who support multiculturalism. And furthermore, it's known that you are a personal friend of Hanne Harlem, the sister of Gro Harlem Brundtland.
Okay, da noterer vi oss
we will make a note
generelle
of that general objection to the legitimacy of the court. I will not really count that as an objection to our legal competence, but I understand that you raise...
So you get the point. He doesn't recognize the court. Breivik is the person that was mentioned in the previous panel that did the massacre of 77 youth on an island in Norway, and the bombing in Oslo that killed another 8 people. So he has a clear manifesto that you can find online where he makes clear that he doesn't like multiculturalism. So he would be on the first of the two facts that I presented as trends, part of these nativist groups that have these identity anxieties, right? But then you get people like Merkel also saying that are showing the trend against multiculturalism.
In Frankfurt, 2 out of 3 children under 5 years old have a migrant background. In the early 1960s, we brought the guest workers to Germany. Now they're living with us. We lied to ourselves for a while. We said they won't stay long, one day they'll be gone. But this is not the case. Of course, the multicultural approach, living side by side and being happy with each other, this approach has failed utterly. That is why integration is so important. Those who want to participate in our society must not only comply with the law and follow the constitution, but above all must learn our language. They must know German. It must be given absolute value. This means that the demand for integration is one of our main tasks for the near future.
So, going back, I hope this illustrated these two facts, even in a scary way. So, what is multiculturalism? What these people, in very different ways, and putting them side by side doesn't imply that they're similar at all, but it does give you a sense of why there is this alarm about the decline of multiculturalism, because when you get a legitimate elected chancellor of the most important country in Europe saying these things that you just heard, but at the same time you get an extremist not recognizing a court and basically not trying to do what everybody almost hoped he would do, that he would claim he was crazy just to get away with it. And he instead, for those of you following the case, he's not only saying he's not crazy, he's inviting more people to do what he's doing, more or less. So you start getting a sense that, yes, multiculturalism doesn't seem to be doing very well in Europe. And even actually some people would say Europe is not doing well in general. So it's not just about multiculturalism. So I'm trying to say there is fire in the sense, and there is definitely smoke, and there's probably a small fire as well. What I'm going to try to do today is start with the most grave situation, as I think I did already, and kind of try to debunk some of this and show that this is not a done deal in a way, not in the sense that I'm going to defend multiculturalism, but just from an empirical point of view and a political science point of view, show that this is definitely exaggerated as a point. So multiculturalism has been presented by people, including Merkel and others, as this living side by side happily without actually changing. Definitely multiculturalism is not, in terms of practices from state perspective, is not what it actually looked like. So I'm following here just a very standard definition that in this case is proposed by Will Kimmelka. I kind of put it together in one form because he actually defined it in 15 pages. So I'm trying to distill it. And basically he's saying multiculturalism is just another movement that comes out of, it's following the decolonization movement and the civil rights movement. And it's basically another type of movement on this road to more human rights and respect for individual and human rights. And its aim is to contest racial and ethnic hierarchies that exist and hopefully lead to a new model of democratic citizenship where you're not discriminated for what you believe or how you look, and so on and so forth, right? So that's a very different definition from let's live side by side without changing at all and just remaining the same. It's actually a model, according to the way that Kimmelka is describing it here. It's a model where both the immigrant community and the host society change, and they try to basically reach a new model, as he says, of democratic citizenship that overcomes these previous ways of being, let's say. Because I don't have time, I was nicely alerted to that fact. I'm going to ask, first of all, are multicultural practices in decline? Where it depends where. Yes, in some places they are in decline, and in others they're not. So when we say such things and we generalize about this topic, we do disservice, first of all, to the profession of political science if we're political scientists, and we're lying, actually. Because, for example, if we look at this index, we basically, this is coming from a report that Kimmelka did from Migration Policy Institute, and he shows that basically, I don't know how much you can see from back in the room, that some countries, like Denmark, we had basically very little improvement, if you want, and then it went back to zero. And in Italy, again, we get a little bit of a decline. So there are some cases that support this trend and this perception, but there are cases where you see that things are doing better. Like in New Zealand, for example, we have moved in a better way. Or in Norway, ironically, and maybe that might have triggered some of this reaction, we also see that multiculturalism has evolved in the past 20, 30 years, and it has actually been enhanced. So that's one point to make, is that if you look at the data, actually, you don't see a trend of decline all over. Second point, well, it depends. Multicultural practices sometimes are in decline for some groups within a country and not others. So if you look at the civic integration policies that I alluded to earlier, and this is from work by my friend Sarah Goodman, basically we see that this trend again, certain groups are being targeted with more favorable policies in a way, because they're being allowed into permanent residency easier. And then if you look at who is allowed to enter to begin with, there is a discrimination, if you want, in that at that stage. So in a way, some groups are experiencing integration policies and some groups are not even allowed in. So when we're talking about the decline of multiculturalism, it varies across states, but also varies across groups. And that was alluded to in the first panel about high-skilled and all that by your presentation. So finally, why are multicultural practices declining in some places? Well, we should ask, is it even about these policies that have failed? Because people assume that they're in decline because they failed. Like Merkel made that assertion in her speech, right? But sometimes we don't know if they're in decline because they failed or because other things are going on, as I argue. And then you use that rallying cry in order to motivate and solidify your constituency, and it has nothing to do with actually the failure of those policies. You haven't even evaluated that, meaning we don't really have really good studies evaluating the effect of these policies, and I invite any of you in the room that has money to give them to me to do that. But then we could know, actually, whether I'm actually serious about this. No. And then, just to illustrate and not piss off my very great, I'm grateful for your tolerance. Just to show what's happening, I think, to illustrate my argument, I think what's happening because of this financial crisis, because of these terrorist attacks in 2001 and everything that has followed, we're getting this movement where the median voter used to be that whole scale, and now the median voter starts already from 3 or 4, and then as a result, the whole political spectrum, as in this beautiful picture, has moved to the right of the debate without necessarily that being the product of failure of those policies, because we haven't really evaluated that. And with that, I leave you with more thoughts than answers. But yeah, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, we have open invitation for research funds. We have heard, I think, very exciting ideas, very thought-provoking. I really thank you for that, Harris. And now we turn to our second panelist, Rachel Neild.
Let me move back the median voter so that you don't, yeah.
Thank you very much. This is going to be a much more sort of pragmatic presentation. I work for the Open Society Justice Initiative. Just to briefly explain, we're part of the Open Society Foundations, but we're an operational entity within the foundation, so we don't do grant making, I'm very sorry. We're sort of like an NGO with our own budget, which is a delightful situation to be in. We started work on non-discrimination issues in Europe. We had a broad interest in trying to get the Racial Equality Directive applied in European courts. In the process, we were looking at different issues around discrimination and the question of profiling by police on grounds of ethnic appearance, what you can't call race in Europe, of course, religion, national origin, and so on emerged. We started to look closely at this, and we've been working on it now since 2005. All of our work is premised on the notions that these practices are discriminatory, that these practices are unlawful under national, regional, and international standards, and that they are in fact very ineffective. And where we've been able to generate the data, I think we've really been able to show that quite persuasively. in these 7 years, we've used a range of strategies. We started with a lot of documentation and monitoring, and I brought some reports. I'm sorry, I couldn't carry very many, but I have more, and I'm very happy to send them to anyone who's interested. And kind of awareness raising, giving a name to the issue, basically. We also did a great deal of advocacy, particularly at the regional level, and we're now trying to get into national level work, which requires honing in on a smaller number of countries. We've also always tried to look at good practice. We've tried to incorporate remedies and not come at this entirely from an adversarial point of view, which can lock you into a very difficult relationship with the police. So we've tried to document what can be done, and we've actually collaborated with police in some countries to introduce those practices through pilot projects. And finally, in countries where there was really no opening to good practice, a couple of years ago we launched a strategic litigation effort, and on April 11th we filed 15 individual cases in the Tribunal de Grande Instance in Paris against the national police for discriminatory stop and search practices. So I guess in a long-winded way, what I'm trying to say is I couldn't figure out quite how to present this here, because there was a lot of different pieces to it and a lot of angles. So I thought I'd just sort of go through some of the kind of different operational profiling practices that we've looked at, and a sense of what is probably inaccurately called trends there. Because while we can talk about practices, and there are certainly strong similarities, there are also really strong national distinctions, both in terms of demographics, of who gets profiled and how, but also in terms of policing cultures. So it's kind of hard to jump to and fro from these sort of broad understandings to the specific levels. So we've looked at profiling in three ramifications. First, ordinary policing, what in the UK we call stop and search, what in most of Europe is called identity checks. Secondly, we've looked at ethnic profiling counter-terrorism practices. And finally, we have somewhat, not enough, looked at the way immigration control within national borders drives profiling. And I think this is an area where more work needs to be done, and possibly we might do some. So we started our efforts in this area actually with a very specific case, a woman called Rosalind Williams, who is a naturalized Spanish citizen of African-American origin, was stopped for an ID check. I think it was back in 1992. And her husband and son, who were both with her, were not checked. So when they asked why, the police officer said, well, we're looking for illegal migrants, and you're black. Rosalind, being a good civil rights activist, took this case on her own dime and on her own energy all the way to the Spanish Constitutional Tribunal, which in 2001 ruled that it was rational for police officers to make a judgment about the likelihood that somebody might be an illegal migrant on the basis of their skin colour. One judge in that ruling dissented and said, demographic changes in this country are moving so fast that we might be able to say that this is true today, even though I believe it carries an enormous risk of encouraging discrimination. But in another few years, this will not be true. We have actually just hired a fellow in Spain, and we're going to attempt to litigate and overturn that judgment. But don't watch your watch. It'll take a very long time to do that. So we took that case all the way to the Human Rights Committee. Sadly, Rosalind ran out of energy and didn't appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. And the committee did rule in her favour and stated that Spain was in contravention of its international treaty commitments, and that race could not be the basis, the decisive basis for a stop, either on immigration grounds or on ordinary stop and search. Now, when we looked beyond Rosalind's case, we basically found that outside the UK, where obviously this is, as in the US, a very well-known issue, profiling was not named, not recognised. The only country that actually had a term for it was France, where the contrôle au faciès, or the délit du sale gueule, is very well known, but where the response to it has been riots, basically. And in order to start addressing this practice, we were going to have to document it, the nature and the extent of the practice. That has been incredibly difficult in the European Union because we don't have ethnic data and because almost no countries make any kind of police data beyond kind of reported crime rates and sometimes some output measures like arrests public. There just isn't the kind of debate that you see in Anglo-Saxon and some Northern European countries, the Netherlands most of all, in continental and southern Europe. There's a very corporatist and different police culture. We used a number of different research approaches, including direct observational methodologies, and I think our reporting really has had some remarkable effects. I brought a couple of copies of a French report where we literally went out and watched police stop people and benchmarked them. And no one was surprised by the results, which showed clear ethnic profiling. But to this day, it causes an incredible discussion because it's ethnic data. And it still remains the core reference point in French discussions of police discrimination. We turned to, however, take a broader look at profiling and try to really put out a report that would sort of encompass some of the way that this takes place. And this 2009 report looked closely at profiling and counter-terror practices as well as ordinary stop and search and sort of flagged some concerns around immigration controls. So we looked at a range of different practices in which it was clear on scrutiny that people were being targeted because of their religion and national origin rather than because of their involvement in or any basis in reasonable suspicion of support for or active involvement in acts of terror. And these practices ranged from mass ID checks outside mosques, the use of counter-terror powers for huge numbers of stops and searches, raids on Muslim establishments, businesses, mosques, surveillance of mosques and Muslim establishments, arrests under conspiracy laws, data mining, and also a particularly tricky and pernicious area is the notion of radicalization. How do you identify the so-called homegrown terrorist in the process of becoming radicalized before they actually take steps to engage in direct support for or terrorist action? And this started with a lot of efforts, particularly coming out of the Netherlands, somewhat in Germany, a little bit in the UK, to develop indicators of radicalization, many of which you can imagine were very clear proxies for religious practice and national origin. These tactics were not used in all countries. I mean, the report talks quite clearly about which tactics were used in which ones. It took us a very long time to get this report out. We had a quite painful editing process, and we had to go and update the research. Interestingly, when we did that, what we found was quite a strong decline in the use of some of those counter-terror powers, and particularly the more scattershot and visible ones. Mass ID checks outside mosques, for example, had come down very significantly. I think this reflects a couple of things. One, there hadn't been another major terror attack on European soil at that point. We're in late 2007, early 2008. And furthermore, for the police, it was really clear that this was taking a huge number of man-hours and not producing any terror arrests. It was producing a few immigration arrests, but that was about it. So I think the inefficiency sort of spoke for itself, and some of these practices really declined. Others, I would say, have not, and I don't want to suggest that Muslims are not to this day still targeted for many counter-terror practices, but they're not necessarily quite as visible as they used to be. What that also tells us is these things they're done for public effect. They're not done for law enforcement purposes. They're done for reassurance of the majority population, and therefore they kind of pop back up. I think very quickly we would see that if there were another major attack. So as counter-terrorism profiling declined a little bit, we also hit the point at which economic crisis starts to dominate the political agenda and the public perception. And at this point you see increasingly aggressive and publicly visible immigration policing using both what in Spain they call redadas, or again it's a kind of mass ID check. The police will come into an area en masse, and often public transport where they know that migrants and people from certain neighborhoods travel to work, and they'll just ID check everybody. Also, and particularly egregious, we saw the security laws in Italy and the deportation of Roma singled out on the basis of their nationality. It was not all Romanians or Bulgarians who were deported, it was Roma who happened to be Romanians or Bulgarians. We saw this copycatted in France when Sarkozy also took it up. The European Commission did respond to these far more weakly than we would have liked and advocated for, but there has been some pushback at national level on those very obviously discriminatory practices. What we also saw, however, have seen is the setting of numeric targets for police. I think it was Brice Hortefeux, when he was Minister of Interior, announced we're going to deport, I actually don't recall the exact, it was 30,000 illegal migrants this year. In order to do that, you can just imagine how many stops and searches you have to do to find those migrants. And we also had reports that because it's very expensive to deport people in airplanes, you want that plane to be full. So the police were being told, we've got a plane going to China, go look for Chinese people. A lot of this stuff has not been adequately researched. It hasn't really come out. There has always been a scandal about numbers. It's a little too Vichy for comfort. So the police authorities have backed off the numeric targets in France and in Spain, have sort of denied that a circular that they sent out to police again setting quotas at the local level was meant to be enforced in that fashion. But in practice, the policies, it is our sense that those policies have very much continued. Again, it's very difficult to get accurate data on this. They don't hand out data on this. You have to go into the communities and try to figure out from them what they're doing. We do also, however, talk to the police unions, and the officers themselves are very unhappy with these practices because it really has extraordinarily damaging effects on their relationships with these communities, who then will not cooperate with them. I'll actually turn around, move on to ordinary stop and search because this is relevant. What we see then as the third aspect of ethnic profiling is just everyday policing. And linked with, but with much longer roots than the current anti-immigration policy, is the notion of problem communities and the targeting of those communities for very heavy-handed policing. Sarkozy is obviously the kind of most notorious example of this in Europe, and the riots that exploded in 2005 were provoked by a police check. We worked with a French partner to do a series of kind of town hall meetings around Paris, and it was very interesting. In communities, people talked about the injustice of current policing practices, but they're also all said we want the police de proximité, France's sort of effort to do community policing, back. This is not just about being proactively targeted in a discriminatory fashion. It's also about a real collapse in police services. And we need safety as well, and we are not being served like the rest of the population. The deterioration in relationships that both that move into hardline problem community policing combined with the kind of immigration policies has produced is a really nasty situation in France. Officers have been attacked, they've been ambushed, they've been shot at, which is a little surprising to think about these sorts of things in Europe. And it has become an officer safety issue, although it's not being framed like that in French political discourse. The other country where I think we found particularly difficult environment for this work is the Netherlands. And the Netherlands has really been the leader of the anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim discourse on the basis of the hostility of Islam to Western values and to liberalism, which I think is enormously enabling to people who normally would not express right-wing views to express them, because then they're on politically correct ground for being discriminatory or for having their prejudice is a politically correct prejudice. And it's been extraordinary to me in a number of discussions in the Netherlands when we have tried to critique these practices. There are a lot of people who recognize this within the police as well. There are a lot of decent progressive police officers who aren't terribly happy with this, but they feel that if you say anything in public, the right-wing movement is so strong that it captures that discourse and runs away with it, and that even critiquing discrimination runs a very high risk of making discrimination worse. I used to really view this as something of an excuse and sort of pushback against working with us in a more public fashion, but it is clearly really heartfelt and deep on their part. I really hope that the PVVs kind of collapse through these budget negotiations and their discreditation politically, at least right now, does start to change that a little bit and open up the environment somewhat. I would just close by saying we really need to get more data. We need to get police to gather their own data and push back on these narratives. Where we have managed to get data, ethnic data on police practices, the narratives have been completely undermined. In Rotterdam, for example, Amnesty International will be putting out a report this fall. They're looking at, amongst other things, immigration stops. There was a series of operations where they did 9,000 stops looking for illegal migrants. They did not find a single one. This is not a good use of your police hours. We piloted the use of stop forms in Spain and Hungary and Bulgaria, where it was a fiasco, but in Spain it went relatively well. In only one case, one ethnic group, did we actually find a higher offending rate. In all the other cases, the offending rate, that is measured by the number of hits that police officers get from stops, was higher for Spaniards. In some cases, they were just spectacularly low for Moroccans, for example. So, you know, we have to push back with the solid facts, I think, against these stereotypes that support these narratives. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I can clearly see a possibility of future collaboration here. We've seen some, calls for need for help and calls for funding. And I think, why not? So just to give you an idea out there. And with that, we'll turn to Terry. Please, Terry, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I will mention I'm going to start off kind of talking about how I got to this research because it's very connected to what a lot of other people in the room are doing. I actually have been studying pretty much all of these topics we've talked about today since I was in graduate school many years ago, back in the mid-'90s. And so my first research topic was radical right parties in Europe, and so I was very interested in Jamie's work because I ran into the issue of, how do you measure, what's going on with these parties, particularly when people who identified themselves as members or even having voted for those parties was lower than the actual voter turnout. And of course, in the most recent French election, there was a situation where all the polls were showing Marine Le Pen at around 13, 14, maybe 15%, and she ended up getting closer to 18%. And of course, that has something to do with how people respond to these polls. But in any case, I'm going to really try to stick to my time here, but there's a lot to talk about. But my first book was on voting radical right in Western Europe, and it actually led directly to what I'm going to talk about today because I was studying the Austrian Freedom Party as well as the German Republikaner and the Danish People's Party and the French National Front, of course. And in 1999, in the Austrian elections, Jörg Haider's party, the Freedom Party, won 27% of the vote and came in second place in the Austrian elections. And this made all the other EU countries at the time, the 14 other EU countries, very unhappy because of the strong showing of the far right in this country. And so one of the responses was to push forward on the EU's Racial Equality Directive, which had already been in the pipeline. And I'm going to go back and talk about how we got to this point where there was an actual directive ready to go, and that was actually passed relatively quickly for the European Parliament and Council. into as an EU directive. I just want to mention a couple quick things on the discourses, because I'm very interested also in this issue of discourses, and just note that it wasn't just Angela Merkel, and I know you know this, but David Cameron and also Nicolas Sarkozy said the same thing about multiculturalism.
Look, I'm Greek. I have to beat on the Germans.
Yeah, I know. Indeed. But when I've of course followed these developments very closely over time, and what I've noticed is that it's very true that the discourses, if you go back, especially even back to the 80s, around this topic, have really shifted into the mainstream. Mm-hmm. That it was in the 80s and 90s, you would have only heard Le Pen and Jörg Haider and others saying these kinds of things, and now you're hearing these discourses coming from mainstream politicians. And not only that, I think there's a lot to work on with the social media side of it, because we're also seeing connections. And so I actually did a conference a little over a year ago on the transatlantic ties between these far-right groups, so both in the U.S. and in Europe. But in any case, to go back to the EU's Racial Equality Directive, if you really want to go back to the origins, it really goes back to the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, because in the late 60s, you had a lot of interaction between Labor Party members and Congress people who were working on the Civil Rights Movement. And so there was a lot of learning going on and exchanges going on around that. And so a lot of the discourses around race relations policy in the UK was actually being driven by what was going on with the Civil Rights Movement in the US. So you go into the 1980s, and you have the first directly elected European Parliament. And in 1986, Glenn Ford, who was a Labour Party member of the European Parliament, was seeing the rise of the far right, particularly in France, and you had the National Front in the UK and so on. And so he had major concerns about, and also actually what happened is you had, I believe it was 9 European Parliament members who were from the far right. And so he felt that there needed to be some kind of response within the European Parliament, and so this was the first time they had a consultative committee that actually focused on anti-racism. And so they had a series of meetings and committee meetings over a year or two, and that ended up becoming the Evergenis report. So the Greeks again. Glenn Ford was the primary mover behind it, but because Evergenis was a rapporteur, his name ended up on it. So
he's from my hometown, so
very good. So this was kind of a first step with the European Parliament taking the lead in moving forward an anti-racism agenda, and it was very much focused on the far-right parties. They did a lot of hearings and getting reports from different organizations that were working on these topics. And then in the early 90s, you had the start of an organization called the Starting Line Group, which was made up of different organizations, including the UK's Commission for Racial Equality, the Churches Commission, which was a Europe-wide organization that was doing a lot of work on immigration, and so on. And this group decided that the best way forward on immigrant integration was to focus on a directive that would basically look at anti-discrimination policy. So I won't go into all the details. If you're interested, it's all here in my over 30 pages. But the key thing here is that there was this progressive pushing of the discourses around, starting off with anti-racism, moving into eventually anti-discrimination, which ended up turning into an article in the Amsterdam Treaty, which has changed from Article 13, now I think it's Article 19. But in any case, that actually gave power to the European Commission to have the ability to legislate in the area of anti-discrimination policy, as well as immigration. Of course, that's the beginning of the European Commission starting to do more directives on immigration in general and anti-discrimination policy. And actually, I've got a couple of articles that talk about this, so that would answer your question, Mary, about kind of whether or not this was least common denominator or more exclusionary or inclusionary. And the answer is it's mixed. Some are more exclusionary, some are more inclusionary. So there's no one answer to that at the EU level. But in any case, this led to, with the Freedom Party going into government in the Austrian government, that the EU then responded, first of all, by having bilateral sanctions against Austria, but then also pushing forward this racial equality directive. So the RED, as it's known, one of the most important components of it is that it called for the creation of an equality body in each of the EU countries. And also, there's also an argument that it wasn't just Jörg Haider's Freedom Party coming into power, but also as the EU was looking towards enlargement, that they were concerned about issues like the Roma and other minorities that might also be impacted by discrimination issues. And so they wanted any new EU members coming in. This is an argument, at least in a couple of articles I've seen, that they wanted any new EU members that were coming in to be bound to this anti-discrimination policy, because of course they would have to implement that directive. So what we see is that it passed relatively quickly, and that, however, of course, implementation is a whole nother story. And so you would expect that a country like the UK, which was kind of the basis for the directive, at least their policies would have an easy time passing this, and maybe countries like Germany that had really no basis for this kind of policy except for what was in their constitution, and some of the newer countries would have more difficulties with it. And so over the last few years, I've actually gone around to several of the equality bodies of the French. It was the ALDE, now it's been turned into the Défenseur des Droits. I've been to the Netherlands and Belgium and Germany to actually visit their equality bodies. And of course, I've also been working with the overarching body for the equality bodies, and also the European Network Against Racism, looking at a lot of their documentation. So there's a lot of material out there on what's happening with these topics. And what I found is it's a very mixed bag. So at least initially, it took pretty much every country longer than, they were supposed to implement it by 2003. Pretty much every country took longer than that, which is not unusual for EU directives. It's fairly typical that they don't implement them on time, which means they have to pass them into national law. So one of the things is to look at, and I'm still in the process of looking at the actual legislation and how it compares across countries, but even that doesn't really give you a firm idea of what's going on the ground, which is why I went to actually visit them, because one of the issues with the MIPEX is that it tells you what the policy is, but it doesn't tell you how it's being implemented. So to look at actual implementation, you really have to go and talk to the people who are implementing it. And over time, what I've seen is that there's been a real politicization of this issue, and I think that ties in very well to what Harris is talking about, because there has been, one of the issues is that in the late 1990s, when the policy was being put forward, you had a lot of left governments in place. And pretty much around 2003, 2004, you see this shift in Europe to more conservative parties. And the conservative parties were also being not necessarily threatened, but certainly influenced by the rhetoric of the far-right parties because they were in direct competition with them. And that was really clear in the recent French election. Sarkozy was really pandering to the Marine Le Pen's far-right parties, or far-right voters. And so there's this really interesting development over time of, in terms of politicization, it's also combined with the fiscal crisis in Europe, which has kind of given governments the opportunity, or they might have made the cuts anyway, but they've made major cuts to most of these entities. And in the UK, it's been very dramatic. When I went to visit a couple of years ago, they had about 500 employees, but they had also been merged. The Commission for Racial Equality had been merged into the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So there was, the first question was, is this a dilution of the focus particularly on race? Because many felt that and this also happened in France, where the HALDE, H-A-L-D-E, was then merged into the Défenseur des droits. And so there was concerns all around that this was just a way of kind of diluting the power of these entities. And this was particularly true in France because there had been a lot of criticism of the HALDE by Sarkozy's government, and because they'd actually been going after some businesses and actually making progress on this issue. So that wasn't particularly appreciated by Sarkozy's government, and so it was felt that this was, and actually in talking to the staff there, they also felt a lot of pressure. I could go into more detail, but I won't because I don't have a whole lot of time left. And so the EHRC, I know, and I haven't seen the latest, but I know they were planning to cut their staff in half. And more recently, there have been even more cuts. And so there have been major cuts on that front. Ireland is an interesting case. I bring it up because there was a lot that was very politicized as well, and the person who was the head of that actually resigned because of the politicization of his equality body. And so we've seen this kind of progressive shift in the discourses, and then again, less support for especially these equality bodies aren't just dealing with race. Many of them have taken on a wide range of issues, disability, gender, pregnancy, all of these different religion in some cases, and gender issues broadly. And so they aren't just dealing with race, and yet that has been very much the focus, is how this race issue is playing out. And so we've definitely seen kind of a decline in how effective these bodies can be because of these changes in the institutional structures, and that has coincided with this shift, certainly from kind of more left to more right-oriented governments, and to more of a change in the discourses and a more conservative discourse around a lot of these issues. So at least in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was certainly more of a focus, and the radical right actually was causing a shift that was perhaps in a more positive direction on anti-discrimination policy. But I think what we can see is that there's kind of an up and down, that there's kind of a shift in discourses that goes back and forth between, in the late 90s, everybody would have said, the Netherlands was, one of the best places for multiculturalism, and that it was, really progressive in this area. And now you look and you see it's one of the more difficult places to deal with. And so, and I also just wanted to bring up one more thing, is that Aristide Zolberg had an article that talked about this issue of boundary shifting and just around this idea of boundaries and how that looks at how that can help define immigrant integration. And so I think what we're seeing is a shift away from kind of boundary blurring, which was kind of the more multicultural approach, to a boundary shifting type of approach, where this whole issue of civic integration is coming into play as, no, we don't want to combine our cultures. We want you to shift your culture to ours. And so there's been this whole trend away from, if you want to call it a multicultural approach or a more expansive approach to dealing with immigrants and immigrant integration, to a more restrictive, no, we have to maintain our culture. You can see that in Thilo Sarrazin's book, in Germany, Germany destroys itself kind of thing, and so on. And I think the fiscal, we'll have to see how it plays out, but I just read an article the other day that was arguing that we're not seeing a return to neo-Nazism, and I would agree with that. With the fiscal crisis, the Greek party is, it's hard to say where it's going from here. We'll see in the next round of the election. But I would argue that there's certainly been a shift towards a more restrictive discourse and more restrictive policies around this, and so I'll end there.
Okay, thank you very much, Terry. I have to say, you know, people have been very harsh on the Netherlands. And speaking of heritage, I was born in the Netherlands, so I actually my talk in the next panel will relate to. I'm sorry. Daarom hebben ze gelijk. Well, we'll see about that. Okay. Well, let's open the floor to questions. Yes, gentlemen. Wait. Yes, the mic. Yes, is on its way.
Commission.
Thank you. My name is Uffe Jensen. I'm from the EU delegation here in Washington. And first of all, I would like to say thanks to all these fantastic interventions. And I'm very impressed by the knowledge about the EU presented here. I hope that we would have a day without mentioning of the Euro crisis, but I Terry came up with it at the end of this tour.
Sorry.
I would have a lot of questions, of course, and but I will restrain myself to just one question to Rachel. Because you mentioned the deportations, or whatever you name them, of the Romas from Italy and from France. And you said that you are a bit disappointed about the response from the European Commission. I must admit I don't know the total background for what the EU did at that time. The Commission normally initiates infringement procedures if a member state does not follow the acquis communautaire. And the infringement procedure in this case was stopped. There could be legal reasons. There could be a lot of reasons for that one. I would like you, if you know about it, to explain it a bit. But I just want to comment that, seen from a European Commission official perspective, the response from our Commissioner for Justice at that time was perhaps the most outspoken response I've heard a Commissioner ever come out with, and it actually created a big scandal. Kind of scandal, because she went out and said, Viviane Reding said that this was something she hoped would never happen or shouldn't have happened the first time ever since the Second World War. So her use of language was provocative at that time. So my question would be to you, what would you have liked the European Commission to do? Because I think we actually came out with a quite strong response politically. Thank you.
Yeah, no, her response was certainly extremely strong, and the kickback in France was extraordinary. I mean, you don't go back to Vichy. To be honest, it was our Brussels office who were doing more work on that, but it has been our sense that, particularly on the heels of Italy, where we wanted to see infringement proceedings moving in a much more aggressive fashion, that in France, as soon as they said, okay, well, we'll stop deporting them, that it was kind of totally end of the matter, and that there hasn't been the kind of conversation about what policies are permissible. I would put you in touch with our Brussels office if you wanted to talk more to them about that. I mean, what I would say is this: although Schengen creates the area of freedom of movement within countries, the lack of competence of the EU in domestic home affairs matters, and therefore in policing, creates some tremendous grey areas where there is very little ability to use regional levers on discriminatory practices at the national level, unless they are very clearly dropping either within the police cooperation mandate, which is very limited, or clearly within the Schengen realm, which also in practice tends then to become very limited. So it's an area in which we don't find an enormous amount of traction at the regional level.
Another question here.
My name is Ioana, and I am Romanian. So I very much enjoyed all the presentations, but I can relate very much to Rachel's. I have a comment, and I would like to pose a question with regard to your programs, if any, in the countries where the Roma population originates from. This is a very personal matter to me. In Romania, we've obviously had the Roma population for 1,500 years now. They first started immigrated from India, 1,500 years ago, and still to this date, they are shunned and not integrated. So in my perspective, it's more problem in the countries where they originate, not so much a problem of the countries in the West. So what we really need to work on in Romania, of course, Romania is a more happier case than, for instance, Hungary, where they also have sort of KKK movements where they follow them and they kill them and they threaten them. It's horrible. And just to give you, again, a very personal example, although personally I come from what the extreme right would say a pure Aryan family. I hate that, and it's so used right now all over Europe. You hear that, people that come from Aryan families and people who don't. My aunt is married to a Roma man, and he is very dark and he looks very Roma, and they have my cousin, a little girl who I think she's gorgeous and she's very beautiful and I love her to bits, but she takes after her father, so she looks very Roma. I cannot even begin to tell you how hard it was for her, and this is the year 2000, to go through school in the rural parts of Romania. So in the big cities, discrimination is not so much of a problem anymore, but in the rural areas, she had bad grades, bad attitudes from the teachers just because she was Roma. After so long, and now she's in med school, she's studying to be a heart surgeon, and only now, when she finally got to Bucharest and she finally got to an institution like med school, she feels, welcomed and accepted by the society. But to tell you the struggles that this family have been through, even if she's mixed, to just keep her in school. And for me, this is outrageous. After such a long time of having this gypsy population, they don't only emigrate because of the poverty, which is not so much an issue anymore in Romania, really it's starting to decrease now, but really because they're not integrated at all in the society, and there are programs now, and they're just not working. So I think we really need to look at the root of the problem, which is what is happening in these countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, even to a certain extent, Hungary very much. And I wanted to ask you, are you doing anything there? Because I think it's more important to be active there it's very important to be active in Western Europe as well. I think you get my point, but thank you.
I'm sure you're aware that Mr. Soros started the Open Society Foundations in Eastern Europe, and it's, we call it the traditional region. There's the Roma programs, which is a major grant-making program, and we've been a big supporter of the Decade of Roma Inclusion. The fact that over that decade so far we haven't seen an improvement in the basic indicators that we were trying to shift is something that's causing a lot of scrutiny and sort of questioning at this point in time. I feel for you so much. My boss litigated DH against the Czech Republic, which was a case about the segregation of Roma children in schools for the disabled. All Roma children were just being plonked into schools for kids with mental and physical disabilities in a systematic basis. And although that ruling went against the Czech Republic in the Grand Chamber in 2008, it hasn't been implemented. So we're looking at those issues and trying to figure out how to implement it. We did work on policing matters in Hungary and Bulgaria with the two countries where we had some partners and got some traction, not Romania, although I do know people are working in Romania. We did a small survey in Hungary in which we found that Roma people were stopped and searched 3 times more often than national majority Hungarians, but that their hit rate was identical. So, the stereotypes, at least what they were stopping them for, maybe the scrap metal trade or some things, there may be some differences, it's not impossible. But certainly the reasons and the places that police were doing those stops and searches did not match with any pattern of offending. It is absolutely those kinds of prejudice. And we did work with the police in Hungary in 2007 and 2008 to introduce good practices and stop forms. It was quite interesting. One of the things we discovered is that Hungarian police do many more stop and search than anyone else, many more even than the British, who are like one of the way the highest in Europe. Police officers don't know, because they don't collect this data, what tactics they're using. And Hungary was just off the scales. And we're like, why? What are you doing? You know, and they couldn't answer it. And the disproportionalities were very high. We had some really interesting experiences, and actually one of the Roma community folks who was involved in the program joined the police afterwards, which was a bit startling to us, but I think positive. And what we found was that the police and Roma communities just never talked to each other. Their only encounters were repressive, police-initiated encounters. There was no structure for communication. Police officers only ever talked to Roma when they were sort of saying, what have you done, show me your ID. Roma never went to police officers. And when we created these forums, it was quite difficult at first, but there was quite a lot of excitement about it. Unfortunately, Hungarian Helsinki Committee, which has tried to keep them going, had an experience recently in which people started shouting racial invectives at the Roma in the meeting. And there's a lot of questioning going as to whether it's even a good idea to put Roma into the kind of situation, these people who want to work, want to improve the situation, but to put them into a context where they're going to be vulnerable and victimized. So we're kind of trying to think about what we can do in that situation, but it's just really, really hard right now.
Thank you, Rachel. Now we'll take a group of questions. I've seen hands before, so I will, the gentleman, yes, yourself, and then we will turn to James, and then we will have yourself, and the last question from the back, gentleman over there. 4 questions.
Jan Domanak, University of Bristol in the UK. I really appreciated how you introduced some complexity in, the title of this conference, the question mark and whether there's an end of multiculturalism. And I wondered, something that is just not very clear to me, and maybe you could just react to that, is when we're asking this question about where we are with regards to multiculturalism, are we talking about immigration predominantly? Are we talking about post-immigration diversity predominantly? Are we talking about both at the same time, and does it matter to make these distinctions? And I think relates to that, and something that came out really well in Harris' presentation, which I enjoyed a lot, the shift from arguments against diversity on the basis of hostility to ethno, cultural, racial homogeneity, preference for that, obviously, towards a strong defense of liberal, secular, values. So the kind of muscular liberalism that David Cameron speaks of, and to what extent this now seems to be the predominant way in which multiculturalism is being attacked. And I think my question is, it's probably not the only question, but one question is that just a continuum? Is sort of the shift from from preference for homogeneity towards muscular liberalism, is that basically one and the same thing, or is it really something radically different that we're seeing? Thanks.
All right. Coming, please. Yes.
Thank you very much, everybody. Just a really quick comment, and I don't know whether you will be able to respond or will want to, but there is a reason that Sarkozy, Merkel and Cameron all said that multiculturalism was dead. There was an electoral reason. They believed it would win them votes to do it. And there's a perception that it has failed. And the reality is, the way that I see this, and the reason it's so difficult, is probably impossible to ever truly evaluate it. I don't know how you go about it. Welcome to try, of course. But there are areas in Western Europe where there are communities which are extremely unintegrated. And there's lots of economic and social reasons for that, but they exist. And other people are worried about that. And I think the problem is those communities get a disproportionate amount of the media coverage. And so there's huge swathes, and we mentioned it before, of people that are very well integrated, very well, and then the silent minority that never get heard. And so all the focus goes on both sides believing that multiculturalism has failed, and there's these unintegrated communities, and there's huge far-right parties that hate them, and we hate them back, and it just multiplies itself. And I think the real challenge, because I mentioned this before, I think, a lot of these people don't feel themselves to be Islamophobic because they constantly read stories that seem to justify their beliefs. So the real challenge is to get more positive and more accurate stories in the types of media that these people and that everyone's reading. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do with the changing way that the media landscape works now. So just if you have a thought about how to do that, would be good.
You should give us ideas from the social media perspective. Just lady right here.
I think it's already on.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Galima Galiulina. I am from Chelyabinsk State University, Russia. And my question, I think, to all the participants of panel, but mostly to Haris and Ahmed. Well known that Islam is not just religion, but lifestyle, mostly lifestyle even. And is the real opportunity to move in direction of civil integration if Western lifestyle, Western Europe lifestyle, and Muslim lifestyle have so many differences? Thank you.
Thank you. Last question, gentleman over there.
This question is for Terry, and it's to kind of follow up on what Joanna was asking about. You mentioned that one of the reasons that some scholars are arguing for the implementation of the RED was for implementation in the Central Eastern European countries. I know it's only been less than 10 years since these countries have come into the European Union, but how have we seen the implementation of that there? Is it being successfully implemented, or are there ways that it could be improved? Thank you.
Okay, I have one request. I think we all, interesting enough myself as well, got a question. But let's try to keep it brief, because we don't want to, be late for lunch. We'll be grumpy with empty stomachs. So why don't we start with the sequence we have received the questions, Harris?
Thank you. Thanks for great questions. I just I'll start actually. I'll try to reply to everybody at the same time. So first, to begin with the Roma question, which is very important, I think, and it kind of touches upon the ghettos or the social isolation that you alluded to in one of your questions. So there is a paper called Marginality, a Micro Perspective by David Layton that tries to explain why certain groups like Jews in many parts of the world and Roma in many parts of the world, because we always think of lack of integration as a product of being poor always, but it's not always that simple. So there are very different reasons why people don't integrate. And that paper, I think, does a pretty good job to explain why certain groups do not melt in, if you want, from an American perspective. And his answer, very briefly, is a cultural division of labor in the society. So if you cannot change what is how the identity of a group is linked to its utility or function in the society, so you cannot actually change their role in that society, and their identity is kind of linked to that. I'm sure Terry has other answers maybe for that, but I just suggest to take a look at that. In terms of the immigration, post-immigration, you're totally right. We shouldn't. That's a distinction we didn't highlight as much, maybe. But that's, in my case at least, it's intentional. I think that we cannot really distinguish that. In the same way that my initial work is on national minorities, which are indigenous, right? And that links very well with the Roma question. In many cases, you have immigrants that are permanent residents, they're not even citizens, they are more integrated than Roma people, as we heard, right? Who are indigenous for centuries, before even those states were created. It's funny how you pose the question assuming that Romania existed 1,500 years ago. It didn't. So basically, we are forgetting that human populations pre-exist states. Now, and that's not to say that it shouldn't exist, but it's just a different point. So that's why I'm blurring that distinction, and I think that's what you're alluding to. Now, There is a work that I would point you to by Jopke in Europe. I don't necessarily think he's right, but he's making this statement that you alluded to, that the liberal secular movement that we have in liberal democracies will eradicate all forms of discrimination, and it's basically incompatible with any ethnocultural or preserving your own identity type of policies. Now, we'll see about that. I mean, a lot of these discussions we're having is because we don't see that happening. So in a way, he might be wrong. But I do agree with you that a lot of the things we see happening are temporary, strategic, electoral kind of gaming. Now, that doesn't mean they cannot have unintended consequences that might be actually much more grave, because what we know, at least from political science, is that many times evolution that works in biology also works in politics, in the sense that you get locked into a position and then you cannot get out of it. So you say something really strong and nationalist, it works, and then you're stuck with it because it worked for some reasons that you didn't necessarily have in mind, but then you cannot change back because you're going to lose your support. So then these things that maybe you even know personally that Merkel told you, oh, I did it only to win that election. Well, tough luck now undoing it, because sometimes these things become self-perpetuating, and that's the evolutionary part of it. Now, I totally agree with the media coverage, and that's where money should go into if NGOs want to do some good, I think, is to promote such stories. Finally, the question about Islam and religion, I think that's exactly where the discussion that Terry brought up about Aristide Zolberg, and then the great work by Richard Alba and Nye here in the United States, which they're trying to reconceptualize assimilation as something that is not a one-way street, that it's more of a fusion, the blurring that you mentioned. But clearly this is not winning ground much in most of the cases that we see in the media, which again goes back to the point, why do we see those cases and others? But that would be an agenda for someone who wants to make this work. It would be, and again, I'm not a politician, I'm a scientist, so I don't take positions often on these issues. But if you want to promote that, you have to start discussing how this is a two-way thing and it's not a unidirectional thing. Now, you need elites to support that to affect the opinions of people, but usually elites follow opinions they find easy to gain elections with. So that's a problem of democracy in a way. And I think we're going to talk about this in the last roundtable, so I won't steal more time for this.
Thank you, Harris. Let's turn to Terry. You got questions?
So, Jan, thanks for that question, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about my book on immigrant politics, which just came out from Lynn Reiner Publishing. So I do look at that distinction, at least it's an edited volume that looks at different European countries and how immigrants, who are, of course, citizens, have become active in electoral politics and where we're at with that. So of course, it's wide-ranging. Actually, I can say something positive about the Netherlands on this front, because the Netherlands actually has very active, people of immigrant origin, as they would say, who are involved in politics, and has been very much encouraging of that. So on the good news side, that's one of the points I'd make. This issue of muscular liberalism versus homogeneity, I think there needs to be some work really tracing those discourses, because I think they're just playing into some of the same kind of concerns and fears. Because you can look at, in the early 2000s, the issue was, what does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be French? There were those debates around those topics, and now we're getting into more, we're just, saying that we're promoting liberal secularism, and to be honest, I don't think it's that much of a shift. It's just more of an issue of what's expedient. But I haven't done the research, so I can't say for sure. On the media issue, I think this is important. I mean, if you look at the burqa ban in France, that was targeted at a very, very small population, but it was seen as, again, a politically expedient thing to do. And I agree that Merkel, I assumed that the Merkel, Cameron, and Sarkozy thing was coordinated, that they, all agreed with that, and that it was, time to say multiculturalism is over. And then on the implementation of the RD, it's been very spotty in Central and Eastern Europe. They haven't put a whole lot of resources into it, and but what's interesting is their legislation is actually sometimes even better than what's in Western European countries, but the actual implementation has been very poor. And I've got some data on that if you're interested. That shows that they just haven't put the resources into it. Some countries only have 1 or 2 people working in the office, which is nothing when you've. But even Germany hasn't been doing very well with it. They have about 20 people working on it, whereas in France they had about 50, and in the UK, of course, they used to have. They still have a lot compared to other countries, but in terms of the actual resources being put into it, it's pretty minimal.
And then I think I was asked a question as well, so here comes my turn, and then we can conclude. A lot can be said, I think, just by starting with your question itself, but I will try to be really brief and basically refer to the phrasing that you have chosen, that is Islam as lifestyle. If we think about this, I'm not going to even spend time about the diversity and how people really practice that, but really trying to get to what I think what you refer to. That is a different, perceived as different lifestyle than, let's say, the mainstream lifestyle of a given, let's say, society, if there is such a thing. And there, I think we can make a clear comparison with, let's say, having a nomadic lifestyle, let's say, just like being Roma, or having a lifestyle based on a sexual orientation, which is, I guess, considered as a non-mainstream in many societies. So we can see that certain practices within Islam are treated as a different, as an other, as an in opposition to, in the mainstream, as a result of very much of the public media and so on, which trickles down all the way to the way we pose our questions and the way we even frame the whole thing. So I think the way to overcome that, this way of thinking, of turning, what Judaism was or what Jews were, or what Roma and Muslims are, let's say, in Europe, that is to say, for most of these, especially populist, if not far-right political parties in their discourse, as the other, as the in opposition to groups. If we kind of really understand what this game is all about, maybe we can actually start a new game. But until we kind of like don't understand this, then we will be stuck in this presumably exclusive and in opposition kind of groupings of Europe, let's say Europe, white, advanced, mainstream, and on so on and so forth, on the one hand, and all these other things, at different historical time points, of course, being Jewish, being Roma, being Muslim, and all the other negative, I guess you could say, and how these two cannot go together. I think this is this binary way of thinking, basically, is the cause of the problem itself. And I think the presentations here have really alluded to how we can circumvent that. And I think the mention about the role of public media, in particular by Jim, was, I think, particularly significant. And I think we'll talk more about these and how to overcome these I guess, binary positions in the next panel. And I thank you very much for your excellent questions and a great discussion. And please join me in thanking the panelists.